5 different streaming locations. It's the beginning of the stream, so if you want to share it on any of your social media profiles on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter, go ahead and give that a retweet. Robert, what's your handle on Twitter? I know I'm already following you on Twitter, but
Pondiscio, right?
Don't follow me. I'm lost too. But yes, Pondiscio.
Okay, so for all the followers, Robert's Twitter handle is kind of like Matthew Nielsen's, where it's his first name and last name, but it's just Pondiscio, at Pondiscio. If you want to follow him on Twitter, he's great to follow on Twitter as well. But we have a really excellent guest that I'm really excited to talk to today with Matthew Nielsen. It's Robert Pondiscio at the Fordham Institute, and he actually came out with a recent book called, sorry, I'm covering you up, Matthew. I do this all the time, but How the Other Half Learns, and it's been a big hit. And I think there was Robert, did you have the Wall Street Journal piece on this, or was it written by someone else?
Yeah, no, I wrote the Wall Street Journal piece the week it came out, so last September, I guess it was. Yeah.
Cool. So yeah, I'll link to that in the comments for everybody to go check out the book, and then also the Wall Street Journal article. Sorry, Matthew, that we're covering you up for so long, but also for our guests today, we are going to give away a free, I always have to put free in quotes, because someone's paying for it. There ain't no such thing as a free book, or a free lunch, whatever the saying is, right? But we're going to give away to one lucky listener for people who are commenting. And again, if you are commenting, we will be able to bring up your comments at the bottom of the page. So make sure you're engaged with the discussion today, so that Robert and Matthew and I can respond to your questions and comments. But then also you can be entered for a chance to win a copy of Robert's recent book, How the Other Half Learns, which we'll talk about in more detail today as well. But looks like we have a good amount of people on. Matthew, you want to get us started?
Yeah, let's get going. So I'm Matthew Nielsen. I'm the founder and board chair at the Educational Freedom Institute. I'm joined by Corey DeAngelis, as always. He's the executive director. I said that kind of funny. I'll say that again. He's the executive director at EFI.
I think you said it better the first time.
Did I? Was it better? All right, we'll just leave it then. At EFI, he is also the director of school choice at the Reason Foundation and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Our special guest today is Robert Pondiscio, former full-time teacher, renowned author and education advocate, and also his most recent book, How the Other Half Learns, author of that book, as we mentioned. So thanks for joining us today, Robert.
It's a delight.
Yeah, our pleasure. So we always start these off, Robert, you may know, we ask a similar question each time of each of our guests, which is, tell our audience, if you would, just more about yourself, about how you became interested at the outset, at the beginning in education, that kind of thing.
Sure. Let's see. I'll make this long story as short as possible. I had a whole other life and career in the media business from the age of 19 until just about my 40th birthday. I worked for a few years in radio news and then spent quite a bit of time in the magazine industry, at Time Magazine and at Business Week. And in about 2001 or 2002, in what I have described as a mid-career impulse purchase, because it was, I signed up for a program called the New York City Teaching Fellows, which is an alternative certification program in the city of New York to get guys like me, mid-career switchers, into high needs classrooms. And this was going to be my 2-year mid-career public service stint, after which I figured out what I want to be when I grow up and go do that. Turned out what I wanted to be when I grow up was a teacher and in education. So my 2-year stint turned into 5 at PS 277 in the South Bronx. Left education, obviously. Got interested in all the stuff that people in ed reform kind of are not interested in. Curriculum, instruction, pedagogy, the stuff that, as I like to say, happens inside of the black box. Those of us who work in ed reform mostly, if you think about it, concern ourselves with the structures of education, with charter, teacher quality, data, testing, school choice, all good things. Don't get me wrong. I'm the guy who says, hey, let's talk about what the kids are doing all day, because that matters too. So my interest, my particular interest, I kind of fell in love, intellectually speaking, with the work of E.D. Hirsch Jr. of Core Knowledge fame. And I've told this story 1,000 times. Every time I would bring this up. I mean, Hirsch was the one guy who was describing what I would see in my South Bronx classroom every day. Kids who could decode but not read. And since I discovered his work, more or less independently, whenever I bring it up in professional development at my master's classes and whatnot, I'd always hear some variation of, "Oh, that's that dead white guy stuff. Nobody takes that seriously." And I'd be like, "Whoa, wait a minute! It's not that at all. It's about reading comprehension, it's about background knowledge. This is the stuff my kids need." This is a good way to make you militant about something when you discover something that you're passionate about, and everybody else is like, "Come on, that's nothing." So that became my cause in education, the idea of curriculum and instruction. And then it was kind of interesting to discover that the ed reform world was obsessed with, charters, teacher quality, et cetera. And nobody was talking about curriculum. So that just became the kind of vein of ore that I mined. And I've gone on too long, but that's basically, what I've ended up doing for the last decade or so is kind of working in the ed reform space, and mostly, but not entirely, focusing on classroom practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it. It is important stuff, because just for the reason that you stated, and the same reason that you become militant about it, it's because people don't talk about that in the ed reform space. So I think, that makes perfect sense to me. Corey, you were going to say something.
Talk about it more than we used to, but I'd still say probably not enough. Especially frankly, guys like Corey DeAngelis, who's like always just blah 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 school choice, and doesn't care at all about what's going on. I kid, Corey.
Robert, I do really like that. You're one of the ed reformers who's who teaches, right, and who's been a teacher for a while and who's taught civics, and that's I think that's a lot of that gives you a lot of insight, obviously, inside the black box. But then it gave you so much insight that you've actually written a book about some of these insights, how the other half learns. So I want to just get the high level overview of your book. What kind of motivated you to write it, and then just what are the key takeaways?
Yeah, so it's actually a similar story, because if you live in New York, if you work in the ed reform space, you don't need to be told who Eva Moskowitz is and who Success Academy is. All about them. But in a way, it was almost the same parallel narrative for all of the stuff that had been written about them over the years. It tended to be about things like political controversies and whatnot. I felt that for all that I'd read about Success Academy and their incredible test scores, I didn't know why they were getting them. I'd even written a couple of op-eds back in the day saying, one in particular, I remember writing that I had no idea, I think the quote was, whether Eva Moskowitz was the Mark McGuire of testing or the Michael Jordan. Meaning, you get the reference, and I'll assume our listeners do as well. And I remember writing in this piece that somebody needs to get up to Harlem and figure out what the hell is going on. And it turned out to be me. But the larger point is, despite the fact there'd been so much news coverage about their test scores and whatnot, I don't think anybody had ever really done the kind of deep dive on what do the kids do all day? What's the curriculum? What's the program? I hope, because I've written so much about that kind of stuff over the years, it made me a little bit less of a figure of suspicion to success. So I was, wasn't easy, but I was able to talk myself into embedding in one of their schools for a year, simply because I understood classroom practice. I mean, I didn't promise them I was going to write them a Valentine, and I don't think I did. But I'm in a position to really understand what I'm seeing every day and translate that to a lay audience. So I think that was kind of the way I baited the hook.
Mm-hmm. So, Robert, it's interesting to me because we've talked a little about this a couple of times about your book, and I've heard you speak about it as well to groups of people. And I wonder if you wouldn't mind telling our audience about there's a particular person in the book that you mention, a student, And I think that, I know you talk about her a lot, and that probably a group of, a large group of our folks have heard this, but I think it's worth repeating if you don't mind. Tell us about Tiffany.
Yeah. And actually, it dovetails perfectly with my previous kind of anecdote about teaching for 5 years in the South Bronx. So the thing that I should have mentioned was there's this kind of neat little bit of symmetry. So I taught in the South Bronx Community School District 7 in New York City, which then and now is the lowest performing school district in New York City. And the school that I taught in was the lowest performing school in District 7. So the Success Academy school that I embedded in for a year to write this book was literally across the street from where I was a student teacher and just a few blocks away from where I had been a full-time 5th grade teacher. And the student that you are alluding to, Matthew, was a young lady named Tiffany, who I have described as, just this unusually focused and diligent, little kid, a 10-year-old girl who would come to school every day in her school uniform, never missed a day of school, never missed a homework assignment, etc. There was no Success Academy back when she was in my classroom in about 2003 or so. But if there had been, she would have been the Success Academy student from Central Casting. I mean, she was, that kid. Mm-hmm. The reason her story resonated with me and kind of had such an impact on me as a teacher and now as a writer, because of an anecdote or just an incident that happened one day where, and again, just to paint the picture here, the school that I was teaching in was extremely low performing. Virtually every kid below grade level, and most of them quite far below. And this young lady, Tiffany, was, on grade level. She was, as we would have said, a level 3 and a double 3, meaning she got 3s on grade level in math and ELA. So, I don't mean this to be dismissive, but that wasn't necessarily a great achievement, by the standards of education at large. But by the standards of that school and at that time, she was, one of the brightest kids that we had. And so I mentioned one day to my special ed supervisor, like, look, I've got this, this focused, diligent kid who's like, teach me something. I'm not doing anything for this kid. And she said something that has stuck with me ever since and really kind of, in a sense, shaped my career. She said, quote, "She's not your problem." So ever since then, I've just described kids like this as the not your problem child. And what she meant, I don't think there was a nefarious intent to what she was saying, but what she meant.
Robert just lost us. Oh, he's coming back though. Right at the climax, Robert. Getting to the punchline, but hey, you're back.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I dropped off, but this lady was on grade level in a school where nobody was, and I was essentially told to ignore her and focus my attention on the lower kids. But now fast forward 15 years, if a Success Academy had existed, she would have been in that school, no doubt in my mind, and nobody would have said to her teacher at a Success Academy, "What are you worried about this kid for?" Every kid is that kid in a sense. Either they walk in the door that way, or the culture shapes them that way. But it just struck me as grossly unfair then and still now that we can look at a kid who is merely on grade level and treat them like they're a finished product. Like that's all the only obligation we have to them. It strikes me as terribly unjust.
And Robert, what do you think systemically causes that kind of incentive? Is there like an incentive structure in place that leads to focusing? Do you have any,
Look, I'll give you the kind answer, okay? Because Corey, this is where you and I we tend to see the world the same way, but we'll probably part company on this a little bit. I'm not unsympathetic to the challenge of teaching in a school like the one that I used to teach. I mean, it's not an insensible decision, right? When every kid in your classroom is below grade level or profoundly grade level, to look at the kid who is more or less where they should be and say, yeah, that one would be fine. It's a decision that no affluent family ever has to be on the receiving end of, and that's the injustice. I mean, nobody's ever going to say, to me as a parent, "Oh, your kid's on grade level. That's fine. We're not worried about your kid." That's unthinkable. But it's not necessarily an insensible decision for a school that is facing just, a tremendous amount of adversity. But, and this is the big but, and I guess this is kind of what upsets people a little bit about the book that I've written. We can't teach or treat children as public property. I mean, because again, at the risk of repeating myself, nobody treats my child as public property. When my kid, goes to private school, or when I move my family to the suburbs, it's unremarkable if an Eva Moskowitz or somebody like that comes along and creates an attractive option for these types of kids and family. Then we say, oh, wait a minute, you can't do that. You're robbing the struggling school of the resource that is that child. And on the one hand, that's not wrong. On the other hand, it's not right. In other words, we don't have the right as a policy matter to put roadblocks in front of those families and say, oh, I'm sorry, no, those white kids, they get to move to the burbs. Those white kids, they get to, go to private school, but not your kid. Your kid's got to stay here for the good of all. I mean, that's just, you can't, it just strikes me as morally, a morally questionable decision to make on behalf of other people's children. So
another thing that I found very interesting with the whole discussion of your book is that, you didn't make people super happy on either side, right? You had a little bit of things to say that made the school choice supporters happy and the charter school supporters happy. And then at the same time, you made the choice skeptics happy as well. Can you talk about why that is, and maybe get into the secret sauce? Yeah, well, it's okay. Yeah, well, just get into the secret sauce of Success Academy and what you found out.
Yeah. Look, it's nice to be, 50 something years old and have your daughter's college tuition paid off and your mortgage retired, because then you can be a little bit more honest, right? I mean, I'm being glib, but I'm also being somewhat serious here. A lot of us in this work align ourselves with one vision of one flavor of education or reform or the other, and I just, look, I say this in the book. I spend the entire first chapter kind of detailing, my biases. Look, I'm a choice guy, I'm a charter guy, etc. But that said, there's stuff in the book that Corey, you just mentioned that choice and charter people will not like, because, the narratives that have attached themselves to this work for the last 20 years have been kind of, simple and simplistic and really advocacy narratives, as opposed to, academic, intellectual, or even journalistically valid narratives. So these stories because the only difference in the door that the kid walks in the morning. They walk in this door, out come, and they walk in that door.
Robert, we're losing you a little bit. I'm going to remove you from the stream and then re-add you.
It's a verse.
Let's see if this works.
I just reset it, huh?
Mm-hmm. I think it might be on Robertson, though. And he was just getting to the point that the choice supporters didn't like. How convenient. There's going to be conspiracy theories that we cut him off.
Right.
Dang it.
So,
but I don't want to steal his thunder. But I mean, here's the point here, right? I think he got back in.
Oh,
Robert, you there? Robert, Can you hear us?
He's muted.
Robert, you're muted. If you can click the bottom left unmute button. Sweet. Okay, you're back. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm giving these long answers and cutting myself off, I guess. I've got bad Wi-Fi. Anyway, long story short, that both of these narratives, pro-charter and pro-public education narratives, are, to quote somebody I never quote, Stephen Colbert, there's elements of truth to both of them, but right. So what does it mean? The I teach in the book that I think made charter supporters and Success Academy supporters unhappy, even though it's a fairly warm portrait, a very warm portrait of what's happening in schools. He said, look, it's just not reasonable to say that these are, this door good, that door bad, doesn't work. There are what I described in some detail, self-selection mechanisms.
Robert, Robert, we're getting a lot of staticky. I don't know why. Is there a way for you to call in like selfie mode on your phone? That could be a good workaround. So we're getting a bunch of kind of choppiness.
Sure.
Hey Matthew, could you send him a link?
Yeah. Yep, I'll send you a link, Robert, on we'll try this. You sound like Wally. Have you seen Wally? Oh, yeah. There you go. Do you have it on your phone?
We're going to get so many conspiracy theories where we cut him off. Dang it.
Yeah, that's too bad. That's
I'm going to send this to, we'll give him extra time to go over that again. I'm going to send it to him on Twitter.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah.
That's the quickest way.
Yeah, I think we missed a lot of the discussion, but I think just for the listeners, just in case we don't get Robert back, as I was kind of pointing out in his Wall Street Journal article, if you want to get this kind of nuanced take, this is where, it really comes out. If you don't want to read the full book, I would argue that you should read the full book to get everything. But he kind of goes in that, and he says, on the one hand, charter schools are supposed to use random admissions. So they are open to the public. They're not discriminatory in that way. But then he says, on the other hand, Success Academy does really well in that they don't cream students, they cream parents, that they have a pretty difficult, selection mechanism in that the parents need to really buy into the mission of the charter school. But that doesn't mean that the charter school says you can't apply, right? So they just kind of, there, Robert's back. Robert. All right. Much better. We were super choppy,
sorry,
and I was just telling the audience that we promised that just because you were, it was almost like perfectly timed, right when you were getting into the things that make choice advocates potentially feel uneasy. That's right when you started kind of going out. So if you can cover those again, it won't look like a huge conspiracy to squash those opinions.
Yeah. Okay. And sorry about the bad Wi-Fi. I guess it's on my end, and I'm not sure what I can do about it other than just try to muddle through. No, the point that was controversial, I think, and I think, look, this has been hiding in plain sight at Success Academy for many years. It's just simply misleading, I think, to suggest that this is a lottery children. I detail in the book, it's a process. There's many steps between in the lottery.
We're losing him again, aren't we?
Yeah. Hey,
Robert.
So Robert, I mean,
number one.
Oh yeah, I think he's asking if there's a number he can call in on.
Yes.
And I don't think that there is actually.
It's just, stream. If
So
the Wi-Fi isn't working on your phone and your phone's connected to Wi-Fi, a good way to get around that is to just disconnect from Wi-Fi and just use 4G if that works better. If it's the Wi-Fi that's causing all the problems.
So I'm kind of disappointed that we haven't heard him. I wanted to hear what quote he quoted Stephen Colbert, but I didn't get the quote, and I wanted to hear that. That was the first time. And then here we go. He's coming back.
He's loaded.
Yep.
Hey,
let's try
that. Sorry, this has got to be very frustrating for people, including you guys. My apologies.
No problem.
It's okay. Actually, it looks like your video's working.
Yeah. So this is the best it's been. So go ahead.
Yeah, I just changed routers to see if that helps. No, the point I was making, and I hope this isn't something I said before I cut out, is that it is simply misleading to suggest that the parents or the children who get into Success Academy are a pure random lottery.
Mm-hmm.
The enrollment process requires parents to jump through any number of, I would call non-trivial hoops to stay engaged in the process. Come to a welcome meeting, uniform fitting, meet the teacher day, etc. And it just seems pointless to deny that this does not, that this doesn't prove to be a hurdle for parents who are not either deeply engaged, or at least who have the bandwidth to stay active in the process.
Mm-hmm.
So what you end up with is a parent body who is either actively buying what Success Academy is selling, or at least willing to go along with the program. You get an active, engaged parent body, and that's just an advantage compared to where I was teaching. I don't know why this is controversial, but it is, and I don't think it should be. And that's so. In other words, I'm kind of occupying a middle narrative here, where I'm saying, look, when folks at places like my old school say their job is harder than for a charter school, well, they're not wrong. And when the critics look at a Success Academy or other high achieving charter school and say, well, look, they've got it easier, they're also not wrong. But again, and critically, that doesn't give us the right to deny that kind of education to those who raise their hands and say, I want that.
Mm-hmm. So this is interesting because Robert, and I've seen it. I'm curious how often you've seen this. In response to your book, I've seen some folks who are critical of choice, public school proud, that will say, see, we knew it. Robert has just confirmed after a year, being embedded at Success Academies, that charter schools cream the best students.
Yeah, and that would be slightly misleading because they're not creaming students. What they are is they are creating what I would describe as a self-selection mechanism for the most engaged parent to send their kids to school with other engaged parents. And if that strikes you as unfair, then you need to answer the question why it's only unfair for low-income families of color, and why it's not unfair when I do that, because I did do that with my kid, or why it's not unfair when, again, families opt out of the public school system, go to private or parochial school, move to the suburbs, etc. So let's just be consistent. In other words, you can't say that this is unfair but okay until or unless an Eva Moskowitz comes along and offers low-income families of color something similar to what the other half gets.
Well, and you have parents selecting into other types of government-run schools too, right? Like by neighborhood through residential assignment, if they can afford the better houses, or the houses that are assigned to the higher quality schools. And magnet schools have selective admissions explicitly in some cases. So yeah, I think that's the right way to look at it, Robert. That we shouldn't look at it.
Let me make one point, if I can. Because I don't want to leave the impression. I want to be really careful about this. That what I just described, this selection process, is the secret sauce. If that's all there were to it, then how do you account for a Success Academy outscoring the gifted and talented programs, which literally do handpick their kids? I mean, from memory, Success Academy now has something on the order of 50 schools and 18,000 students. If it were a standalone school district, it's big enough to be one, it would be by far the best performing school district in the state of New York. So in other words, they have closed whatever achievement gap is associated with the gifted and talented, with the $1 million home on Long Island and Westchester. Those school districts are now chasing Success Academy. That's a hell of an accomplishment.
So Robert, you're based in New York, right? I think I heard something about New York potentially getting rid of or trying to get rid of their gifted programs. I don't know if that was just something in the media or someone was arguing against it. What are your thoughts on that, of getting rid of the gifted programs in the residentially assigned schools or the district schools?
I think it's a bad idea. I mean, look, I get cranky about this, and I want to be careful here because we are at a political moment right now that feelings have been kind of rubbed raw around issues of race and equity. But it just strikes me, being old enough to have lived through the bad old days in New York, in the 60s and 70s, where you had, anybody who had any kind of means and mechanism of leaving the city did. It just strikes me that we're making some of those same mistakes again. And I would, there's a chancellor in the city of New York, Richard Carranza, and the mayor, Bill de Blasio, who are, they seem determined to squeeze any advantage that ambition gives to a family out of the equation. That troubles me.
So what do you think is the, there's obviously no like silver bullet to improving, the system, but from the takeaways of your book and seeing that, parental engagement could be important. Do you have any recommendations or how we can improve the whole system? I know it's a tough question because there is no silver bullet, but maybe just anything.
Yeah,
improve.
No, I mean, I've already confessed my choice preferences, but I think where I might disagree with some of our more doctrinaire choice advocate friends is that I don't view it as a magic bullet. Not that they do, but there's a reason that in addition to being a choice advocate, I'm also a curriculum and instruction guy. Because you can have good schools of choice and bad schools of choice. You can have good district schools and bad district schools, and that is probably more of a function of their curriculum, their pedagogy, their school culture, than the fact that this one's a charter school and this one isn't. So I think both of those things. I don't want to have to be. I don't want to have to pick and choose. Either a choice guy or a curriculum guy. I think it either all works together or it doesn't work at all.
Mm-hmm.
But having said that, look, I think you're more likely to get a good outcome in a school of choice for any number of reasons. There's just fewer moving parts, right? You have more control over hiring and firing. You have more control over your instructional program. You can set a culture and say, look, this is how we do things here, and if this is not for you, then it's not for you. It's much harder to do that in a traditional district neighborhood zone setting, and I think we just need to be candid about that.
So, go ahead, Matthew.
I was going to say, tell us about how Success Academies, and not maybe even just them, but how the other half has done during lockdown. You've talked at least a little about that, and so if you want to tell us how they've done and maybe what you think has contributed to that.
Yeah, I think they've done well. I mean, let's be clear. Right now, I've been gently chiding my ed reform friends here because, we see our kids in front of Zoom all day and we say, oh, look, their school is adapted and there's learning going on. Well, we really don't know, right? So, I mean, my gentle chiding here is we used to be about outcomes and now suddenly we're intrigued with inputs. We see a kid in front of a computer and we assume, good things are happening. So let's just be consistent and admit that we really don't know, whether this is effective, teaching and learning or not. It's better than not making the attempt, but we don't know. But look, back to your specific question, Matthew, every visible indication is that Success is doing quite well with this. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about this. When COVID first hit, Success closed down a few days before the New York City school system did, and they hit the ground running. Within a week, they were up and running and reaching virtually every kid. And as time has gone on, parents in the system have told me that they've kind of keep upping the rigor and upping the complexity. So it looks like they are very much a model of what it looks like to transfer schooling into this kind of remote learning virtual system that we're all kind of fumbling our way toward or through. But again, I want to be clear, everything about their program and culture set them up for success, no pun intended. They are already technology minded. They already have deep levels of parental engagement. They already have a teacher force that is in constant communication with families. So all of the kind of the systems and routines and cultural touch points that other schools were trying to create, well, they had on day one, because that's just the way they roll, so to speak. So yeah, we've got a lot to learn from them, and never bet against Eva Moskowitz. She's this unusually gifted organizational leader. It would not, so again, we don't know how they're doing, but it would not surprise me if the same thing that got me interested in them 5 years ago, that they were getting better when everybody else was getting worse. It wouldn't surprise me if we ever see standardized test results ever again, that they're still killing it.
Yeah, Robert, I've heard a bunch of anecdotes on either side of this, right? There's been a lot of parents who felt like they're getting a lot out of distance learning, and that their districts are doing a good job. And as you said, that Success Academy's been doing a good job. Then you've heard the other side of this, right? That a lot of districts haven't been doing a good job. So I wanted to get your just quick take on this recent Wall Street Journal article, and just maybe just even your take on the headline. Wall Street Journal just came out with an article with a couple of their reporters that says the results are in for remote learning. It didn't work. What are your just two cents on that? I guess.
Sure, right? I'm actually writing a piece about this right now that I guess will go up on Rick Hess's blog, which I'm guest posting for this week. And look, some of the points in the art are what I just said. It's a little bit premature to say it did or it didn't work, because we simply, if anybody has measured, what learning is happening, I haven't seen it. We're just measuring, the degree to which schools are up and running, the degree to which parents are participating, or students are participating. We know more about, like, say, attendance and touch points than we know about, actual learning. Look, whether we like it or not, we kind of have to get good at this, or at least acceptable at it, pretty soon. There's, and I'm a lot less doctrinaire about this than some others. I'm quite willing to forgive, a multitude of sins from March to June, when districts were caught up short by this stuff. Schools are complicated places, and they've got a lot of things to do besides teach. They are, for good or for ill, civic centers, community centers. They feed kids, etc. Those are. I'm not dismissive of those functions whatsoever. But as this goes, as the uncertainty lingers from COVID, as this goes from, say, an acute to a chronic condition, at some point you don't have the luxury of saying, well, we're just going to do the best we can. In other words, it just strikes me as good governance at this point, that every school has to either, be good at this or have some plan in place for continuity of service if there's a second wave, for example, later in the year, if the vaccine doesn't materialize. At some point you kind of have to do your job and do better than just kind of shrug your shoulders and say, well, we can't. So it's just ironic, right, that especially those of us in the ed reform space who have kind of dumped all over online learning and online charter schools for years. I'm reminded of the Toby Keith song, "How Do You Like Me Now?" We kind of have to get good at this now, and we can't really afford to sneer anymore at online schools, because there are two types of schools in the world. Those are online schools. Those that are online schools, and those that will be.
Yeah, well, and that's a great point, right? So on Friday, Corey and I talked to Jeff Kwiatkowski of K-12 Inc. Yeah. And we talked about a little about that. And I think you're right. That we were kind of, it's funny if you look back, just go back maybe 10 years and take a survey of all of the policy proposals that came before state legislatures, before school district boards across the country, and see how many times, virtual learning or blended learning model, or similar phrases came up in official public meetings. And I think you'd come up, I don't know that I've done this, but I can imagine the stack would be high, right? I mean, that stack, that list would be really long. We were all just forced, 350 million of us, were just forced into what we had been talking about for over a decade. We need to get there. We need to get there. And then overnight, it's, if you're not there today, then you're not serving kids well, and so on and so forth. So I think you're exactly on point there.
But let's be really, really clear, Matthew, which is that, and maybe you guys will agree with me on this. I'm old school enough to think that, well, let's just be honest, that this is never going to be quite the substitute for brick and mortar schools. Now, look, and I want to be clear on this as well. That's not a value judgment. I completely respect those who want to, educate their children virtually. Not my kid, not my choice. But most Americans, I think, have the cultural habit of sending their kids to a place called a school. Not just to expedite their learning, but to be around other kids, to make friends, to be in a space without their parents, so to speak. That's a real value that people have, and it's not going to go away. So regardless of how one feels about online education, it's just getting more complicated. How about that? We don't have the luxury of saying, do it this way, don't do it that way. We're just going to have to be a lot more nimble and more flexible than we are used to being. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about this. I mean, I have not seen any, this is where I guess I'm going to agree somewhat with that Wall Street Journal article. The early returns are not likely to be promising. I've been kind of, thinking about this, because you've seen all these articles that, this works really, really well for some kids, and some families are discovering that this is fantastic and they're going to continue it. Well, then there's a lot of other families for whom exactly the opposite is true, which, by the way, isn't this true about everything in education? Dylan William has this wonderful phrase about how everything works somewhere and nothing works everywhere. And that's exactly right. So that, a more sophisticated view of this just means that good practice means you have to have a lot of arrows in your quiver and be prepared to service kids and families in the way that's best for them.
Yeah.
And I think that just goes back to the school choice argument, right? That for some families, homeschooling, they could see that it worked, right? And maybe they'd want to switch, but like you're saying, for a lot of families, either because of work scenarios, or because they just they don't feel like they have the qualifications, or whatever it may be, maybe a brick and mortar school works better for those families. So I think you're right that there is a lot more nuance than just homeschooling for all or brick and mortar school for all. We need to be able to allow families to sort into those different environments based on how confident they feel in being able to do these things, and then also just their preferences, right? I also wanted to get your thoughts on a couple of things. Here's a recent tweet that just came up. It has over 600,000 likes, I want to say at this point. 658,000 likes, went viral. This one went viral. Another one that was similar went viral. Sometimes people copy each other on Twitter. There's another one that has like 200,000 likes. That's pretty similar. But this seems to be going around like wildfire on the internet right now. But here's the quote for the listeners. Defunding the police sounds radical until you realize we've been defunding education for years. What are your thoughts? Regardless of the police, debate, what are your thoughts on the entire quote?
Look, I remember the first time, because I think I painted the picture earlier in this discussion, that I kind of walked in to my first teaching job, wet behind the ears for my relatively advanced age, just not really knowing a whole lot. I think I hadn't been in an elementary school since I'd been an elementary school teacher or a student rather, and then next time I was there for 30 years later as a teacher, and I remember being stunned in my naivete the first time that I realized that every student in front of me back in 2002, 2003 was costing the city of New York, I think, $18,000 a year. And I remember thinking, holy hell, tell you what, I'll take 10 of them. I'll teach them in my apartment. I'll give them lunch. Give me that money.
Be better off.
And by the way,
half a third of the class size.
If they those really small class size, and if they don't pass the test, then don't pay me for that kid. I remember just being shocked by the amount of money that we were spending as a city to educate these kids, and frankly, not very, very well. Look, school finance is not my area of expertise, but it just kind of strains credulity to think that that is the answer, or that we are not, or that we're underfunding kids. Look, my school, again, lowest performing school, lowest performing district in the city of New York. We had lots of problems. I just don't think that was one of them.
So,
and the trend is incorrect, right? As well, like in and in the U.S., that we've consistently increased inflation-adjusted education spending. We haven't defunded it, unless you have some really weird definition of what defunding means. Maybe if you don't increase it by 20% a year, then that's actually defunding. A 10% increase is a defund relative to 20% increase, I guess. But I just thought this was amazing that it went so viral. I freaked out when I saw it at 300,000 likes, and just within a day or two since then, it's over doubled. And
wow.
Regardless of all the replies to it saying, this isn't actually true, it's just kept going and going and spreading like wildfire, like I said, with other people copying the tweet and it going viral as well. And then with this individual, where's the Twitter fact check when you need it?
I told my wife about this tweet yesterday, because Corey was all over it on Twitter, and I was like, he's replying to every single person. I think all 658,000 of those people. Not really,
Corey,
but
do the people who sign your paychecks know that you were on Twitter all day? Do they know that?
Hey, that was all weekend. Yes, and of course everybody knows I'm on Twitter.
So I told my wife
You're
about
cool with that, right?
They're cool.
Yeah,
They've
my tweets.
So I told my wife about it, and she goes, "That's crazy." And she knows enough to know, because I tell her all this stuff anyway about what the funding is, and we see something in the news, and I'm a geek and I'm a nerd like that, and I tell her stuff like that, and so she's up on all of it. So I tell her that, and she goes, she recalled that our oldest daughter she attended a Title I school, very high, I think 85% plus FRL school, elementary school for her elementary years. And she said she was reminding me, she had her own computer, her own laptop that was just assigned to her. She had 3 paid field trips all over the state, for the year, which they were never paid in any other school. And she goes on and on about all these funding related amenities that were given to her, because we were living in this area where we were assigned to this school. And so all that to say that, just to drive home that point, that money isn't the answer. And
you're preaching to the choir somewhat. And again, because this is one of the reasons why I focused so much of what I do on classroom practice. What we have in American education is not necessarily issues of governance, not necessarily issues of finance. We have issues of competence, right? I got a lot of grief from guys like Corey DeAngelis, when I was supporting Common Core a few years ago, and I'll own that. In my way of thinking, it was an opportunity to kind of focus on classroom practice, focus on the inside of the black box as opposed to all these other things. Not that I love standards necessarily, but I remember saying and meaning it. But look, what Common Core will really do is surface the practices, the problems of practice that we have in this country. It's not going to fix it, but what we're going to discover is that if you have the idea, this is where my the limits of my choice fandom, as it were. If you have the idea that American education, that teachers and administrators know what to do, they just need to be freed in order to do that. Let me promise you that's not true. It's a good thing that those who have a vision and are competent should be free to do what they do. But we have a massive problem with just delivering even the base level of good instruction and curriculum in this country, and all these other problems, including finance, do not address that.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. It reminds me of a study that was done about teachers, and this was, I can't remember when it was done, but it talks about teacher certification, the quality implications of that certification, and does it really mean what we think it means? I haven't been able to find that again, but I need to dig that up. Anyway, all good points there. So, Corey, did you have something?
I was about to Google that teacher certification study. I know Jason Bedrick has shared it on Twitter before, but yeah, it's essentially you see the two distributions where the teacher quality levels seem to be pretty much the same, whether they're certified traditionally or not. Brookings, a Brookings paper. But I wanted to ask Robert about his blog that just came out at the Rick Hess Education Week blog. If he comes back, I think Robert just signed out on us. But while we're waiting on Robert to come back, he's now his device is connected, so we might not want to switch back to Robert. Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
We can see you. Can you hear us, Robert?
I can see you. I can hear you a little bit.
Okay. We can hear you and we can see you. So we want to talk about your piece on the Rick Hess blog.
Okay. Yeah, stirring things up again today, apparently. In the sleepy little backwater. Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear what the question was, but I'll just pretend that there was a question. I'll just tell you about it. I teach to this day, at least part-time. I teach high school civics at a charter school in New York City, Democracy Prep, that has civic education at its core. That said, so civic education is kind of my side hustle, I guess I would say, in this work. And I've just noticed, I mean, you can't not notice that we're just not very good at teaching civics. I don't mean where I teach, I just mean American education in general. and little of it that we do tends to focus on government. And if you start to look at, civic engagement at the broadest possible level, there's government and there's politics, and that's important, and we valorize voting to kids all across this country. But the earnest question that I'm asking my fellow civic educators with this piece is, are we getting to the point where partisanship is so virulent and so white hot that it's getting in the way of the broader goals of civil society? In other words, there are three sectors, so to speak. There's the public or the political sphere, there's the corporate or private sphere, and then there's this kind of third sphere. Things like churches, community organizations, social clubs and whatnot. The kind of things that volunteer fire departments that really are important to keeping communities running. And all of those sort of third sector civil society institutions depend on an extraordinary degree of trust and tolerance of each other. And if we're getting to the point where partisanship is interfering with our ability to work together on the PTA, to have our kids play Little League alongside each other, to be good neighbors, to be friends with our, in churches and whatnot, well, then my earnest question is, do we need to rebalance this? So what's controversial about this piece, the title of it is, I think, I teach civics and I'm not going to vote. This is just a decision for me. I'm not trying to impose this on anybody else. but I'm using this to ask, like, hey, look, is it time that we really kind of view the larger civic or civil society initiatives and purpose of education, and maybe just kind of tone it down a little bit on the partisanship, because it's probably more than we realize getting in the way of our working together across intellectual political differences in our communities.
So I mentioned this the other day on another one of our, might have been with Neil actually, last week with Neil McCluskey. I think I mentioned Yuval Levine's book, who Robert, you tweeted about that. I picked it up. I read it on your recommendation, and I thought maybe I'd ask you about that, because that dovetails perfectly into what you just said. The institutions that we all rely on, that we all participate in as Americans in society. I'm curious to know, relative, maybe we relate it.
I've lost you guys.
To schools. Can you hear me? You're choppy a little bit on the video, but that's better. Is it cleaned up?
Yeah, I didn't hear a question, but I did hear you say Yuval Levin. I think I've sent that book now to about a dozen of my friends, and he's about the best and sharpest writer in print right now, in my humble opinion. His most recent book, I think it's called The Time to Build, is about this crisis in our public institutions, and he makes the point that institutions in our country used to shape and constrain us, and now they become platforms, for performative spaces. And I think he's just dead right about that. Mm-hmm. And you see it in the media, you see it in our politics. Look, hey, we're doing it right now, right? I mean, we're all supposed to be education people, and here we are, in public playing a performative role, as opposed to being in our schools. So let's not be those who are. What is the saying? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. So I'm not guiltless in this myself. None of us are.
I just think it's interesting, and earlier I had the thought, as you were talking about success academies, and I thought, some of our schools become, and maybe some is the wrong word, but maybe it's closer to all, and maybe it's somewhere in between. I don't know, but I wonder if some of our educational institutions become collateral damage to the politics of the day, and I think that is we're especially at risk of that right now, and in this context of a time to build, right? And Levin's words on that, and his thoughts on institutions. I wonder if our K-12 system, the kids in our K-12 institutions across the country are becoming collateral damage to partisan fights. What do you think?
Well, look, I think it's even more basic than that. This is where, okay, I'm on a roll, so I won't stop. Now I'll stick my thumb in the eye of my ed reform colleagues. This one is on us, right? We have arguably debased education in the last 20 years for good reasons. Look, I mean, let's not pretend that there was a golden age of American education where everybody just kind of did really, really well. I've described my complicated relationship with testing, for example, but that doesn't mean I'm anti-testing. But when I say we've broken education to a degree, we have, in the name of greater equity, in the name of trying to correct the historical damage that's been done to low-income kids of color in places called school. We've kind of spread the damage around a little bit. We've been guilty, I think, of kind of reducing education. This is overly broad, but if the point of things like No Child Left Behind were to make bad schools more like good schools, sometimes we've done just the opposite. We make good schools look more like bad schools by curriculum narrowing and whatnot.
Right.
So I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush, but this actually gets back to me one of the big takeaways from Success Academy in my book. Like this is my biggest defense of what they do. You don't have to love Success Academy or Eva Moskowitz, and you can look at their brand of education and say, yeah, look, I don't like this school. It's too harsh. It's too militaristic, etc. But consider what it represents, which is a school where, based on how we keep score, test scores, damn near every kid goes home at the end of the school year with a level 3 or a level 4, and they think, hey, I'm good at this. I got a state test result that said that I'm just as good as those kids in Scarsdale. I'm just as good as those kids in Jericho on Long Island. And not only that, all of my friends are. So in other words, that just, as a civic matter, that just changes the relationship of a community with a place called school. And whether you like what they do or not, my long-term bet is that's going to pay real dividends, because at the end of the day, isn't that what a school is about? It's not so much the test score. It's about, this is a place where I go to kind of find my way into the American mainstream, to find something that I'm good at, to try my hand at a challenging task and persevere and see what that's like. If all you know of school, and this has got to be the experience for the vast majority of low-income kids of color in schools in America, if all I know is I don't do well here, they don't seem to like me here, they don't hold me to high expectations. If you contrast that with a Success Academy, which is just the opposite, they hold you to very high expectations. A lot is expected of you, and then you are challenged, you are pushed, and then you're successful. And then that I just have to believe that just changes the dynamic between a community and this thing called school. And in the final analysis, whether I like or don't like what they do at Success Academy, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
So, Robert, I know we're getting a little over an hour, but we've had so many glitches that I think it's okay to go a little bit over this time. But you hit a little bit on the test score piece, and I just wanted to ask you, how do you define like a high quality school, in particular, like a high quality charter school, for example? What's your definition of, how do we know if this school is one or bad one?
Define it. Yeah, I would prefer not to define it. I mean that earnestly. In other words, I think about the choices that I had as a reasonably affluent, white guy in Manhattan. When it came time to choose a school for my daughter, it was kind of comical, actually, because it was at the same time I became a school teacher, a public school teacher. I mean, to say more than I perhaps should, my wife was a private school girl. I was a public school boy, and private school was the price of peace in our home. And oh my goodness, what a price! But it just struck me, when you talk to well-off, Upper East Side Manhattanites, who act like the difference between a Brearley, a Chapin, is the difference between looking at the moon and walking on the moon. And I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, there's not going to be a bad outcome. Like, all these schools are great. And I contrasted it, rather pointedly with the experience of the students that I was teaching. They didn't have a choice. And if they did, their choices would be bad, worse, and oh my God. So it's just, I don't want to be in the business of defining what a good charter school or good school looks like for low-income kids. What I want is for them to have the same opportunity that I had when it came time to choose for my daughter. I want them to be able to have those discussions that say, oh, no, KIPP is not success. Success is not achievement first. I would never send my kid to this school. This one is different. There is no reason on God's green earth to assume that every parent is not capable of that fine-grained distinction between schools. And it is not up to me to make those choices for them. It is up to us to make those choices available to them.
Boom. I love that.
That went really well, Robert. I couldn't have said it any better. That was perfect.
Well, I'm gonna quit while I'm not too far behind.
Matthew, do you have any final questions for Robert?
I do, but he's already been really generous.
Let's give him another one.
We really could go on forever, but I'll just ask one final one, and maybe we'll have to. That just means we'll have to have you on another time if you're willing. But for now, yeah. So my final question, Robert, would be more about the flexibility. I want to touch on that again. I want to talk a little about, if you would, what you think parents are not going to be willing to give up going forward. As the lockdown occurred, certain things were put in place, and some families may have loved what was going on there and said, hey, this worked really well for my family, and some may not have. And we talked about that already. But what do you think schools in the next 18 to 24 months are just going to have to do? We are going to have to build these flexibilities into school in order to meet the needs of kids and families.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think I only heard about a third of that question, but I think, just give me a thumbs up if I've got this right, that you're asking me what all schools need to do for the rest of the year to kind of meet parents. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer because I don't think we know. And I think we need to be realistic about this. I mean, we talked about this some earlier. I don't think we have the ability to assume that, or there's lots of different scenarios, right? The four basic ones: everything's going to be normal in September. We're going to have a blended scenario in September. We're going to have an online only scenario or we're going to have one of those three, and then something happens and we go back to lockdown. On the one hand, it's easy to say, well, schools have to be prepared for all of those eventualities, and that's probably true. But I hate to be, and I don't want to conclude on a dour note, but you brought it on yourself by asking me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let's be really clear that for the population that I've worked with in my entire career, low-income kids of color in places like Harlem and the South Bronx, we're not that damn good at this, right? Under the best of conditions, 4 out of 5 low-income kids of color are not reading at proficiency according to NAEP by 8th grade. So we are right now, today, under the best conditions, failing 4 out of 5 low-income kids of color. There's no reason to think that we're going to suddenly get better at this under these uncertain conditions.
Mm-hmm.
But look, I would hope what this would mean is that we get serious about, okay, here I am promoting my own ideas, that we really get serious about curriculum, about learning, about pedagogy, about what happens in the classroom as opposed to all these things that happen outside the classroom. But I think that also argues for trying to return to as normal a setting as possible, as quickly as possible, because again, we're not that good at delivering quality instruction under ideal circumstances. I just see no reason to be optimistic we're going to get suddenly good at it under these kind of uncertain circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. I think that's fair. Good answer, Robert.
Cool. Yeah,
So I wish I had a better one, but
yeah. So I think we should wrap it up. It's been well over an hour now, and I just want to remind all the listeners that we will be selecting a random listener to get a copy of Robert Pondiscio's book, How the Other Half Learns, and we will announce who the winner is on Facebook and Twitter for the listeners, and we'll send you a copy of the book. So thanks for everyone for watching, and I will share a link to the book again in the comments, and then also Robert's Twitter, so you can go follow him on social media, and maybe tweet at him so that he can respond to any of your questions that maybe we didn't get time to answer today. But thanks to everyone for coming. And Robert, do you have any quick last second takeaways that are just where people can find your work besides the book?
I'm hard to miss. On Twitter, our Pondiscio, on Facebook, all my DMs are open and whatnot, so you can DM me and yell at me and call me bad names.
Thanks for your time, Robert. This has been great. We really appreciate it.
Sorry for the glitches, but I appreciate your patience. Thanks.
No
all.
problem. Good to have you.
All right. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Robert. Have a good
Thanks.
one, everybody.